Intro: 15 action films where the real fight was behind the scenes. We've all felt it. That raw pulse when fists fly, bullets tear through the air, and everything explodes in perfect chaos. Action films are built to thrill us, to orchestrate mayhem, precisely calculated for our adrenaline. But what if the chaos didn't stay on the screen? What if the real fights happened off-camera in silent standoffs, screaming matches behind trailers, or in stunts gone so wrong they rewrote entire productions? Hollywood is full of legend, but behind some of the biggest action films ever made lies a different kind of legend. Directors fired mid-shoot, actors refusing to speak to one another, entire crews walking off set, or a lead role so cursed that people feared coming to work. These weren't just movies, these were battlefields, and the most brutal scenes weren't even film. It's easy to be swept up by explosions and slow-motion showdowns, but beneath the surface, many of these productions were imploding financially, emotionally, sometimes physically. Studios kept it quiet, tabloids only got fragments, and yet the scars left behind were all too real. Some of the films you're about to see became classics. Others fell apart under the weight of their own behind-the-scenes wars. But all of them prove one truth: what happens when fiction collides with reality and loses control? Let's step behind the velvet curtain and into 15 action movies where the real fight wasn't written in the script. Fact Hasson, Mad Max, Fury Road, 2015. It was chaos not just on screen, but behind the camera. When Mad Max: Fury Road roared into theaters in 2015, it was hailed as a masterpiece of kinetic energy. But what most didn't know was that the real explosions weren't all part of the film. On set, Tom Hardy and Charlize Theron, the two leads, were locked in a silent war. The production was shot in the Namibian desert under extreme heat. Days stretched on, tempers boiled over. Hardy, known for his intense method approach, was often late to set. Theron, a disciplined performer, was furious. The tension got so thick that the two would refuse to talk unless the cameras were rolling. At one point, a producer was flown in just to mediate. They had to shoot scenes with the leads standing meters apart, not because of character conflict, but because they simply couldn't stand each other. Director George Miller, caught in the crossfire, chose not to intervene too much. He let the tension bleed into the performances, and maybe that's why their hatred felt so real. Ironically, after the film's success, Hardy publicly apologized to Theron, admitting he was difficult and emotionally closed off. The damage had been done, but so had the film. It won 6 Oscars, and behind every frame was a battle no explosion could match. But friction wasn't new to action sets. Some started falling apart from the very first day. Fact #2, The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1996. It was supposed to be a surreal sci-fi epic. Instead, it became a production meltdown that felt more like a horror film. The Island of Dr. Moreau was already a risky venture. The story was strange, the setting remote, but no one expected the chaos that unfolded once cameras rolled. Within days, the studio fired director Richard Stanley, replacing him with veteran John Frankenheimer. Why? Stanley reportedly clashed with producers, disappeared from set, and couldn't control the spiraling budget. But the real nightmare began when Marlon Brando arrived. Eccentric to the bone, he demanded bizarre script changes, wore an ice bucket on his head in scenes, and insisted his character have a miniature clone played by a mysterious 2-foot-tall actor in whiteface. Brando refused to learn lines, forcing the crew to feed him dialogue through an earpiece. Meanwhile, Val Kilmer was feuding with everyone. He showed up late, argued with Frankenheimer, and at one point even allegedly burned a crew member with a cigarette. Frankenheimer, exhausted, declared, "I don't like Val Kilmer, and I don't want to be associated with him ever again." Amid all this, Stanley, the original director, sneaked back onto set in disguise, dressed as a mutant extra, just to watch the wreckage unfold. The final film was a mess, panned by critics, and nearly destroyed careers. But behind the camera, it had already destroyed trust, sanity, and any hope of control. And yet, there are films where the chaos drove people beyond breakdown into something darker. Fact #3, Apocalypse Now, 1979. There's method acting, and then there's descending into madness. Apocalypse Now is legendary for its descent into the heart of cinematic darkness. But it wasn't just the story. The making of the film became a real-life war zone. Director Francis Ford Coppola took the cast and crew deep into the jungles of the Philippines. Typhoons destroyed sets. Equipment vanished. The production schedule ballooned from 6 weeks to over 200 days. The budget tripled. Coppola mortgaged his house just to keep filming. Martin Sheen, under immense stress, suffered a heart attack mid-shoot. He collapsed, alone in the jungle, and wasn't found for hours. When he returned, the schedule was already in tatters. Meanwhile, Marlon Brando showed up overweight, unprepared, and refusing to read the script. His scenes had to be rewritten entirely. Coppola began losing his grip on reality, reportedly threatening suicide, and famously said, "We had access to too much money, too much equipment, and little by little we went insane." The result? A film hailed as a masterpiece, but the cost was staggering, not just financial, but psychological. Some crew members never returned to filmmaking. The jungle had swallowed them whole. And if this was a war story that lost its soul in the jungle, wait until you see the one that nearly drowned on open water. Fact #4. The Revenant, 2015. It looked brutal on screen. It was worse in real life. The Revenant was meant to push boundaries, and it did. Director Alejandro G. Iñárritu demanded natural light only, remote wilderness locations, and no green screen. But that commitment to realism nearly broke everyone involved. The shoot took place in freezing Canadian forests, often in negative 30 degrees Celsius conditions. Crew members had to trek for hours just to reach set, carrying equipment on foot. Tempers flared, morale collapsed. Dozens of crew members quit mid-production, citing unsafe conditions and Iñárritu's relentless perfectionism. Leonardo DiCaprio, in pursuit of Oscar glory, endured hell. He ate raw bison liver, slept in an animal carcass, and filmed a scene while half submerged in icy rivers. He later admitted, "It was the most difficult shoot of my career." But it wasn't just the cold. Behind the scenes, Iñárritu was reportedly clashing with producers and department heads, rejecting backup plans and calling for constant reshoots. Assistant directors were overwhelmed. Budgets spiraled. One producer warned, "We're one stunt away from someone dying." Eventually, the entire production had to relocate to Argentina because snow melted too early, a final irony for a film defined by its icy pain. The film won multiple Oscars, but it left behind a trail of exhaustion, resentment, and crew members who vowed never to work with Iñárritu again. Still, at least, The Revenant survived its director. Some films weren't that lucky. Fact #5. Waterworld, 1995. It began as an ambitious post-apocalyptic epic. It ended as one of Hollywood's most infamous disasters. With Waterworld, Kevin Costner wanted to create something revolutionary, a floating world, fully shot on real water. But from the start, the production was cursed. A massive custom-built set was anchored off the coast of Hawaii, only for a tropical storm to destroy the entire thing, costing millions. That was just the beginning. The budget exploded to $175 million at the time, the most expensive film ever made. Costner, both star and producer, was clashing constantly with director Kevin Reynolds, who reportedly walked off post-production, leaving Costner to finish the film alone. Meanwhile, the set was hellish. Crew members suffered seasickness, dehydration, and sunstroke. At one point, Costner was nearly swept out to sea while tethered to a 40-foot sail. Stunt doubles quit, makeup melted in the heat. One helicopter pilot reportedly refused to fly again after a near crash. Tabloids began calling it Fishtar, a reference to the box office flop, Ishtar predicting it would bankrupt the studio. Yet somehow, despite everything, the film broke even, and over time, it found a cult following. But Waterworld remains a cautionary tale. When ambition meets nature, nature wins. And not all fights involve the elements. Some come from the actor who's supposed to lead the show. Fact #6, Blade, Trinity, 2004. You can't fake chemistry. And in Blade, Trinity, there was none. Wesley Snipes had made the Blade franchise a hit, but by the third film, something had changed. According to cast and crew, Snipes became hostile, withdrawn, and nearly impossible to direct. He reportedly refused to leave his trailer for hours. When he did, he wouldn't speak to director David S. Goyer or to co-stars Ryan Reynolds and Jessica Biel. Instead, Snipes would communicate via post-it notes, signing them Blade. Things got so bad, that the crew began filming scenes without him, using stand-ins and visual effects. Reynolds later described the set as tense and weird, and hinted that most of their scenes together were done under duress. One day, Snipes allegedly physically confronted Goyer. Security was called. Tensions never fully settled. The once proud franchise limped to the finish line with a film widely panned by critics not just for its script, but for its lifeless energy. Behind the scenes, the real vampire wasn't on screen. It was the toxicity draining the set dry. And if you thought feuds between actors and directors were messy, wait until you see what happens when the studio itself starts pulling the strings. Fact Raute 7. Die Hart 1988. It redefined the action genre, but no one believed in it, not even the people making it. When Die Hard was greenlit, Bruce Willis was far from an action star. Known mostly for TV comedy, his casting sparked outrage. Posters initially hid his face, fearing backlash. Inside the production, things were no better. The script was being rewritten daily, sometimes between takes. Scenes were filmed before knowing how they'd connect. Director John McTiernan clashed with producers over tone. He wanted tension and realism. They wanted a crowd pleaser. The studio, already skeptical, was on edge over every delay. Willis was also under pressure. He was filming Moonlighting during the day and Die Hard at night, surviving on 2 to 3 hours of sleep. His hearing was permanently damaged after a stunt explosion went off too close. At one point, the stunt team nearly walked off due to safety concerns. Behind the scenes, it felt like a gamble spiraling into chaos. But in that mess, something real emerged. A vulnerable, human action hero trapped in a building he couldn't control. And perhaps that's why Die Hard still resonates. It was born out of total uncertainty, carried by a man nobody believed in except himself. But not all storms are invisible. Some sink entire ships. Fact Hashite, Titanic, 1997. People remember the iceberg, but it was the set that nearly sank Titanic. James Cameron is known for pushing limits, but on Titanic, he nearly pushed everyone overboard. The film was shot in an enormous water tank in Mexico, under brutal conditions. Days stretched to 16 hours. Temperatures plunged. The cast and crew were constantly wet, cold, and exhausted. One night, things took a bizarre turn. Over 60 crew members fell violently ill after eating lobster chowder, which was later found to be laced with PCP. To this day, no culprit has been identified. Cameramen hallucinated. People collapsed. Cameron himself was vomiting and bleeding from the eyes. Even without sabotage, the shoot was intense. Kate Winslet chipped a bone in her elbow. DiCaprio suffered from hypothermia. Extras were fainting from dehydration. Cameron reportedly screamed instructions through a megaphone, earning the nickname Iron Jim. Eventually, multiple crew members quit, some swearing never to work with him again. The film went over budget, over schedule, and nearly broke the studio. Everyone predicted disaster. Instead, it became the highest-grossing film in history for a time. But that's the thing about chaos. Sometimes it sells tickets, and sometimes it breaks people entirely. Fact #9. The Shining, 1980. The horror wasn't just in the film, it was in making it. Stanley Kubrick was obsessed with control. On The Shining, that obsession became something darker. Shelley Duvall, who played Wendy Torrance, was pushed to the brink of a nervous breakdown. Kubrick deliberately isolated her from the cast and crew, demanded endless retakes, including the infamous bat scene, which took 127 takes. Her hair fell out. She cried daily. In one interview, she admitted, "It was almost unbearable." Kubrick was methodical with Jack Nicholson, too, feeding him raw meat and keeping the set freezing cold to keep him on edge. But he treated Duvall differently, not to sharpen her performance, but to crush her emotionally. The crew was forbidden from offering her comfort. Some later described the atmosphere as psychological warfare. Kubrick's daughter documented much of it, but even now, opinions remain divided. Was it justified for the performance or outright abuse? Either way, The Shining left deep scars. Duvall stepped away from acting for decades, and the real terror of the film lingers most in the places no one ever sees, in the long, cold corridors between takes. And if psychological torment seems extreme, wait until you meet the director who went even further and lost everything in the process. Fact Hasson Zero, Troy, 2004. Muscles, swords, glory, and egos sharper than any blade. Troy was built to impress. An epic scale, a star-studded cast, and fight scenes choreographed to perfection. But off-camera, the production was far from harmonious. Brad Pitt, portraying Achilles, had creative clashes with director Wolfgang Peterson. Pitt envisioned a more grounded, psychological portrayal, while Peterson pushed for grandeur. Tension brewed, shots were rescheduled, dialogue was rewritten to satisfy both visions, but the conflict remained. Then came the stunts. In a particularly ironic twist, Pitt, playing the near-invincible Achilles, tore his Achilles tendon during training. Production halted for weeks. Meanwhile, Eric Bana, playing Hector, accidentally broke Pitt's thumb during a choreographed duel. The scene made the final cut, bruises and all. Crew members spoke of a divided set, with Pitt isolated and increasingly frustrated. The pressure to deliver a modern sword and sandal classic weighed heavily. Studio executives hovered, fearing budget overrun. Despite it all, Troy premiered with global fanfare. But Pitt later admitted he took the role for the wrong reasons, to fulfill a contract, not passion. On screen, warriors clashed for honor. Off-screen, it was a battle for creative control, and no one walked away without scars. But while Troy dealt with wounded pride, another set struggled under something more mechanical. Fact has so known RoboCop 1987. A cyborg law enforcer, a dystopian future, and a lead actor on the brink of collapse. When Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop went into production, no one anticipated the hellish transformation Peter Weller would endure. To portray the robotic titular character, Weller had to wear a suit that weighed over 40 kilograms and took nearly 11 hours to put on during early shoots. Temperatures inside soared. Weller could barely move or breathe. He lost weight rapidly, suffered heat exhaustion, and was known to pass out between takes. Communication with the crew broke down. His frustration grew so intense that he briefly walked off set, threatening to quit. Verhoeven, equally intense, didn't help. He screamed directions mid-take, pushing for perfection. The atmosphere was, in the words of a crew member, machine-like, cold, loud, and relentless. The shoot dragged on, budgets stretched. The makeup team was constantly modifying the suit, trying to make it tolerable. At one point, Weller began training with a mime coach in secret because he felt the director didn't understand the physicality he was aiming for. Despite it all, the performance became iconic, stiff, detached, haunting. But it came at a cost. Weller would never return for RoboCop 3 because some roles, once lived in, are simply too brutal to revisit. And if mechanical madness wasn't enough, what happens when the madness belongs to the director himself? Fact has shown to Heaven's Gate 1980. This wasn't a film. It was a $44 million implosion. Michael Cimino, fresh off his Oscar win for The Deer Hunter, was given complete creative control over Heaven's Gate. That was the first mistake. What followed became one of the most catastrophic productions in Hollywood history. Cimino was obsessive. He reportedly had sets torn down and rebuilt because the color of the grass was wrong. Extras were asked to stand in perfect military formation for hours, just for background shots. Some scenes were shot over 50 times, with no major changes between takes. The film's original budget was $11 million. It quadrupled. Shooting lasted over a year. At one point, the crew joked they were making Vietnam, the sequel. The director's behavior bordered on tyrannical. He banned watches on set, enforced silence, and micromanaged every department. Studio executives panicked but were too late. When the film was released, critics savaged it. It bombed at the box office, and United Artists, once a powerhouse studio, was sold shortly after. Cimino was blacklisted for years. Heaven's Gate is now a cult classic to some, but its legacy is written in chaos, a warning of what happens when ambition consumes everything. And sometimes, that battle isn't with a director or actor, but with the person writing the checks. Fact Hasson 3, Mission Impossible 2, 2000. It was meant to be a stylish evolution. Instead, it became a slow-motion standoff between star and director. When John Woo, master of Hong Kong action cinema, was brought in to direct Mission Impossible 2, the studio expected a fusion of Eastern flair and Western blockbuster spectacle, but they forgot one thing: Tom Cruise doesn't share the spotlight. From the outset, Woo's signature-style balletic gunfights, operatic camera work clashed with Cruise's demand for tight control over tone, pacing, and screen presence. Reports from the set describe constant tension. Woo wanted wide shots and long takes. Cruise wanted close-ups and precise edits. The crew was stuck in between. Some scenes were shot multiple ways, one for Woo's vision, another for Cruise's. Eventually, the editing room became a battleground. Woo's original cut was drastically shortened, and entire sequences were reshot or restructured. Adding to the tension, Cruise performed most of his own stunts, including a dangerous free climb scene on a cliff shot without a safety net. Studio execs were horrified, but crews insisted. Some say it was about commitment. Others saw it as an ego-driven game of brinksmanship. The film was a commercial hit, but Wu never returned to the franchise. He later admitted, "I had no control." It's ironic, a film about control, betrayal, and double crosses, undone by the same dynamics behind the scenes. But at least no one died. Not every production was so lucky. Fact Hasson 4, The Crow, 1994, a tragic hero, a cursed set, and a bullet that should have been fake. Brandon Lee, son of Bruce Lee, was poised to break out in The Crow, a gothic revenge thriller with supernatural overtones. But what happened during filming blurred the line between performance and real death. Late into production, during a scene involving a prop gun, Lee was shot in the abdomen. The blank cartridge was faulty. A fragment of a previous dummy round had been lodged in the barrel. It discharged like a real bullet. He died hours later on the operating table. The crew was shattered. Filming stopped. Investigations began. Rumors swirled of a Lee family curse. Safety procedures were scrutinized. Lawsuits followed. But what many don't know is how chaotic things were even before the shooting. The set was plagued by accidents, carpenters injured, electricians electrocuted, props malfunctioning. Crew members described it as a cursed atmosphere, intense, disorganized, and reckless. Lee had been vocal about poor stunt coordination. He reportedly performed many of his own stunts, often with minimal rehearsal. The production was rushing to meet deadlines. Corners were cut. After his death, producers decided to finish the film using early CGI and stand-ins, a controversial move. Some called it exploitation. Others saw it as honoring his final work. The result? A haunting performance, frozen in time. But behind the ghostly beauty of The Crow lies a brutal truth. A man really died for the shot. And if death can haunt a set, what about something darker? Fact Hasson 5. The Exorcist, 1973. The horror was never just fiction. The Exorcist is one of the most terrifying films ever made, not just for audiences, but for the people who made it. Director William Friedkin was obsessed with authenticity, and what he did to get it would today be considered criminally abusive. Actress Ellen Burstyn suffered a permanent spinal injury during a violent stunt, yanked back by a harness so hard that her scream in the film is real. Linda Blair, only 12 years old, was left with lasting physical and emotional trauma. Friedkin would fire guns on set to get reactions. He slapped a priest across the face to make him act shaken. The set caught fire. A crew member died during production. 9 people connected to the film passed away before its release, leading many to believe the set was cursed. The tension wasn't just supernatural. Friedkin was at war with everyone: studio executives, crew, cast, and even the author of the original novel. He pushed boundaries until they broke, and yet the result was undeniable. The Exorcist became a cultural phenomenon. Audiences fainted. Theaters brought in paramedics. Critics called it revolutionary. But behind every scream was a real injury. Behind every prayer was real fear. And behind the director's genius was a man possessed by his vision, no matter the cost. Some action films show you hell. Others drag their creators into it. Bonus fact: Resident Evil, the final chapter, 2016. This one didn't make the top 15, but it might just be the most brutal of all. During production of Resident Evil, the final chapter, stuntwoman Olivia Jackson was performing a high-speed motorcycle sequence. The shot involved her riding toward a camera mounted on a mechanical arm, which was programmed to lift out of the way at the last second. It didn't. The arm failed to move. Jackson crashed into it at full speed, collapsing her face, shattering bones, and leaving her in a coma for 17 days. She lost her left arm. Her spinal cord was damaged. Her career was over. The production continued. Later, another crew member, a technician, was killed on set when a Humvee unexpectedly rolled over him. These weren't near misses, these were casualties. Jackson eventually sued the producers, alleging gross negligence. The case drew attention to the dangerous corner cutting behind many big-budget action films, especially in international shoots with less oversight. She won, but the cost wasn't just physical. It was the betrayal of a system that failed to protect her. The film itself made millions. Reviews barely mentioned what happened. In a genre built on danger, most of what we see is choreographed. But sometimes, the violence is all too real, and the camera doesn't stop rolling. Because behind every action film, someone is risking more than just a shot. We watch action films to escape, to feel the thrill without the consequences. But now that you've seen what really happens behind the curtain, which moment shocked you the most? Was it a director pushing too far? An actor refusing to back down? Or a stunt gone horrifyingly wrong? Tell us in the comments. When does commitment to realism become recklessness? And which of these productions would you have walked away from?